everyone. Today, our special guest is Stephen Webster, Dan Markel's last attorney. So, thank you for being here, Stephen.
Thank you for having me.
And is it okay to call you Stephen?
Please.
Okay, thank you. I know you're on vacation, so we really appreciate your time. So, would you like to tell us a little bit about your personal background?
Yeah, so I went to undergrad, college later in life, kind of finished it as a night school endeavor. I was pouring concrete at the time for a living. And I had a friend who got accused of a crime he didn't commit. And as I was kind of finishing my degree at night school, he was dealing with that criminal charge and meandering through the system. And it was really kind of disheartening how it all unfolded. But the night that I took my last class was a Thursday night. His trial began the next morning. It's like 2 years of his life that he had this hanging over him, house arrest, all kinds of pretty tough stuff. And the judge, I know now what happened, but the judge dismissed the charges the next day at jury selection. I went to his party that night to celebrate, and I knew I was going to get my diploma the next day, my degree. And I told him I was going to apply to law school. I was looking at his public defenders. They were younger than me. And so I did, and got accepted at FSU, went to FSU, got out, worked at the state attorney's office for a couple of years, and really enjoyed that job. And, I felt that's where I met Georgia, a lot of the other people. And went into private practice 2009-ish, working for a white collar criminal defense lawyer in town, really kind of prominent lawyer. And then worked with another lawyer who's very well known in Tallahassee, he had a very kind of a general practice, and he was a brilliant man, is a brilliant man. So I learned a lot from him and started my firm in 2013. And met Dan Markel shortly thereafter, which changed my life in ways I could have never imagined, because just before Dan was murdered, he introduced me to my law partner, Louis Jean Baptiste. I had asked Dan if he knew a law clerk, a law student who might want to do some clerk work. And I told him, I said, look, this isn't Holland and Knight. This is the law office of Stephen G. Webster. I don't have time to sit around and babysit somebody. I need somebody who has confidence and who can be a self-starter and could just hit the ground running, because I just won't have the time to sit around really and offer much guidance. He said, I know just the guy, and introduced me to one of the most important people I've ever met in my life and will ever meet in my life. He's like a brother. He's like a uncle to my children. And so Dan delivered that into my life just before he was murdered. So that's kind of my background.
So interesting. So where did you grow up?
I was born in Columbus, Georgia, but I really grew up in West Palm Beach. I moved down to West Palm Beach, and I think I was 10 years old, and grew up down there.
Oh, that's funny. Are you familiar with Albany?
I am. Absolutely. It's pretty close to me.
Yeah, I grew up there.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, until I was 8 years old. Then we moved to Conyers, then Stone Mountain. So
nice.
Yeah. So I'm very familiar with Columbus.
Some of my very good friends from West Palm Beach actually moved up to Stone Mountain. So
interesting. Okay, small world. Yeah, and you said your dad is from Raleigh.
He's from where?
You said your dad's from Raleigh?
He is. My father, his family, all of his family, they lived in Raleigh, Durham, Hillsborough, that area growing up. Mm-hmm. My grandmother basically ran a boarding house for students at Duke University, and my dad and his brothers and sisters, they would all chip in to help mom wash and cook. And it was kind of how she fed my father basically, and all of her children, was because she would cook family style meals for the students at Duke, and then her children would get to eat right along with them. So it's kind of an interesting story. When I was working for another lawyer, an older lawyer came in, they were meeting, and we started talking, and he had gone to Duke, We started talking about that, and he was kind of at the right age. And I said, my grandmother used to run a boarding house there for students at the university. And he said, well, I probably knew, who they were. I mean, he said, it's such a small community back then. And I said, well, she would cook big family style meals, and every Sunday it was like a big deal. And my dad had told me that kids would come from all over to eat, not just the students that were living there. And he said, oh my gosh, I ate dinner with your dad and your uncles and aunts and your grandmother, because he remembered
Crazy.
Mm-hmm.
So random. Yeah, and I had no idea you worked in construction before going to law school.
Yeah, I poured concrete for a lot of years, built a lot of roads down in South Florida.
So sort of like Sigfredo Garcia and Luis Rivera.
Yeah, no, they probably drove, no doubt they drove over some of the roads that I built. We did work out at the Alligator Alley. And I know they took the Alligator Alley. I believe they did. So there's no doubt that they were driving over roads that I built, coming and going.
So how old were you when you went to law school?
I was 32.
Oh, okay. Interesting. So very unconventional.
It was.
Yeah.
It was. I felt it was. I was afraid it was going to be awkward, but it wasn't. There were quite a few older folks there, even older than me. And FSU Law was a great college. I mean, Dan was, he was working at a law school that really is a fantastic law school. Our former dean, Dean Widener, who was the dean when I was there, he really did a lot to kind of build the professional esteem of FSU Law School. He brought it up into Tier 1. And one of the ways you do that, I know now, having gone to law school, is by getting professors, attracting professors that have, kind of top-notch pedigrees and backgrounds like Dan Markel had. If Dan would have wanted to, I mean, he certainly could have left FSU, and I guarantee you he would have been recruited eventually by some big top-tier law schools if he had stayed. But it was law school was fun for me.
Mm-hmm. Great. So you graduated, and it sounded like you hadn't been practicing that long before you met Dan.
Before I met Dan, so I started practicing in 2005. So I met him in 14. So.
Okay. And how did you meet him?
A friend of mine, Tor Friedman, somebody I also met at the state attorney's office. Actually, I met Tor in law school, but he worked at the state attorney's office with us as well. Tor knew that I just started my firm. He was probably worried about me. He's a good friend. And so he called me, and he knew Dan. He knew Wendy as well. He knew Wendy, I think, from college, if I recall correctly. And he called me and said, look, a friend of mine, they've already gotten divorced, but there's still a lot of ancillary litigation that's going on, and it's pretty hot. And he said, he's going to end up in court, and he needs a lawyer that can go into court with him. Basically what Tor was saying to me was this isn't going to be like a motion practice type case. That stuff that's water under the bridge. It's time to go into a really hot contested hearing. And he said, and I really think you could help him. And, I told Tor, I was like, Tor, I don't do family law. And he said, it doesn't matter. He's a law professor. To the extent that there's anything that you need to learn, he'll teach you. I said, well, that makes sense. And I had done some family law, like a couple of the law firms that I worked with. We would do a lot of pro bono type family law stuff. And, I booked a class in law school. So, I felt like I could at least be competent enough if I had to, but I understood what Tor was saying. What he was essentially saying is this isn't a situation where you're going to bring in the client, do all the intake forms, do the financial affidavits, and all the stuff that you family lawyers do. He was basically saying you're going to have go up a trial, and it's going to be hot. And I was like, okay. So I agreed to meet Dan at a coffee shop that's since closed on Tennessee Street, close to the campus. And I got on the clerk's website the night before, and I read every one of the papers that were filed between the two of them. And certainly with Dan, I got the impression that he was ghostwriting essentially a lot of the papers, and his lawyers were, filing them, but it was kind of exhausting. And I had the strong sense that the court was probably not happy with either side. And on some levels, perhaps the court may have felt disrespected, is what I was concerned with, that maybe the litigants weren't doing what they were supposed to do, weren't abiding by court orders, et cetera. And so when I finished reading the papers that night, I had pretty much decided I was not going to get involved. It's one thing to have a fight. I mean, that's part of the profession. We have to go and get into some uncomfortable situations sometimes. But I didn't want to be in a situation where I was caught between my client and the court and the judge. Tallahassee's legal community is small. And if you do things that the court kind of finds disrespectful, it's just not the kind of way I want to practice. So I had decided I was not going to get involved, but I was going to meet him. I told him I'd meet him. So I went in.
That's nice of you, because most people would just say, no, thanks, don't want to meet you.
After I read the papers, I could tell he needed help, frankly, and he needed a lawyer, as did Wendy, but he needed a lawyer. And so I kind of felt, on some levels, I felt a little bad, like I was maybe leaving him in a lurch. And so I certainly was going to go meet with him. But when I met with him, it totally changed my mind. He was very easy to talk to. He was not a firebrand. He was not, kind of out of control, which I was afraid of. I was afraid that this was a person who had a very acrimonious divorce, and he was still harboring a lot of residual hurt and anger and was inflammatory. That wasn't the case. He was very cool. Not really necessarily what you might think of in a law professor, especially not one with his background. And he was funny. He was real affable. We really laughed, and I just felt like I was making a friend as opposed to just getting a client. I certainly didn't expect that to happen. So he convinced me. Once he started to talk, he convinced me that he had the evidence to prove that Wendy had not been honest in a lot of her filings. And it was enough for me to believe that the courts would understand Dan's position as long as it was presented the right way. I expected we were probably going to come in and the judge was going to be hot. But I felt like if we could play our cards right, eventually we could slow things down. And if we could start bringing out our evidence, I felt like I would be able to stem the tide and show that my client was not the bad guy, that Dan Markel was not the villain in the equation. That while maybe he would be subject to some criticism for some of the things that he did and didn't do, but I felt like ultimately we were going to prevail. And in essence, it was a criminal case at that point. I mean, that's what it was. It was contempt going both ways.
Attempt. Yes.
I mean, and somebody, that's, and I was like, as a former prosecutor, criminal defense attorney, that's kind of right up my alley anyway. And then he was, I see the question there from Dawn. Dan was not. That was why I decided to get involved, because I was worried about that. Because I told him straight up, I said, look, I'll be your lawyer, but I'm not going to be your mouthpiece. I'm not going to sign papers that you write. That I don't practice that way. And I told him, I said, you need a lawyer, like bad. The old adage, a lawyer that represents himself has a fool for a client. Dan was in that position where, he absolutely needed to stop kind of the way things were going and go a different direction. No more kind of ponderous pleadings and filings. The time was over for that. And I was worried that he would never allow that to happen. But I was wrong. No, he said straight. He said, I know I do. I will listen to you. I will defer to you. So I said, okay. And I was convinced that he would do it, and he did. He was very, 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 very easy to talk to. We laughed. I mean, we would laugh, talk, and just kind of talk about being dads and things like that more than we would really the case. And we were drafting some stuff that I had recommended. That was the direction we needed to go. And he was always available, but except when he was with his children. If he was with his sons, and I've said this before, and it's the truth, and I'll say it every time I have a chance to talk about Dan Markel. I'm going to talk about the father that he was, because he absolutely inspired me to be a far better father. He changed the way I look at life and fatherhood altogether. I'm not saying I ever lived up to the standard he set, but it was certainly something to aspire to. But I remember one time I called, and it was a call that we needed to have, and it was important to him. But as soon as he answered the phone, he said, "I'm with the boys at the park. I'll call you back." And he hung up. I said, "Okay." You know what I mean? And it just kind of reinforced everything that he had demonstrated to me up to that point about where his passions lied and what he cared about and what he treasured. And it was the children. So he was surprisingly easy to work with for me.
Okay, that's good to hear. So did you note that there was supposed to be a deposition of Donna Adelson taken?
I did not. We didn't get to that point. We were heading towards the hearing. And I was trying to set up a few things before the hearing. And in essence, I've talked about it before. It's not a secret. We were preparing a request for admissions, and I essentially wanted to force her to admit that she had committed fraud in her earlier filings. And we had pretty much, I'd finalized those Thursday night before he was killed. And Friday morning, we were supposed to finalize them and file them. But Donna, I can't recall if that was something that we were going to still pursue. I would have certainly loved the opportunity to cross-examine her, still would. But her involvement at that point for me was really her calling him stupid in front of the children, doing things like that. I know that he had put that in papers, but he had also told me he heard it. He called like on a Zoom call or Skype or whatever. I think it was Skype, sorry. And she wasn't on screen, but he heard her, knew her voice. He said, "Stupid's on the phone," where his boys could hear it. And that was what he was mad about. I've said it, when I testified in the trial, and it's the truth. That was the place where I saw the real anger from him. And that was the only place. I'm telling you, like, he showed some hurt still to me. I could still tell he was hurt, the way, what he called the Pearl Harbor type divorce, but he was angry about that being called stupid in front of his children, and the alienation was something that he was not going to tolerate.
Yeah, seems like she was like a third wheel in the marriage.
Big time. Yes,
Yeah.
she was, and even after, no doubt about it. Yeah.
Okay. Well, this is a question. Did Dan ever express his feelings about Charlie or feeling unsafe?
No. I know we talked about Charlie, but it was nothing that was really a big deal. Donna was a big deal. And as far as being unsafe, he was worried about his children being poisoned, their minds being poisoned against him and being alienated from his children. So that's, a huge concern. The psychological well-being of his children is what he was worried about. But he never expressed to me, look, in a million years, I was worried that Wendy was going to accuse him of like battery. Like Judy, you probably have seen this in your
Yes.
practice. when I worked at the state attorney's office, I saw it a lot, where I would get the impression that people were making false allegations of domestic violence after divorce proceedings had been initiated in order to gain a tactical advantage in the divorce, get injunctions, stuff like that. And I'd actually told him shortly before he was murdered, because I had the impression that he was still seeing her every now and then and talking to her. And I just said, look, I don't know if you still see her from time to time and you guys have casual conversations, but if you do, that has to stop, because I'm worried she is going to accuse you of hitting her, and then she's going to use that as the mechanism in order to try to get the boys back down to South Florida, because she had failed in the other motion to relocate. And I was worried she would be desperate enough to maybe do that. That was about as evil as I thought the Adelsons could go, frankly. And so when the police called me to ask me how I knew Dan Markel, because I had called him probably 18 minutes after he was killed, 15 minutes after he was killed, I was calling him back so we could finish our papers. And I had told Wendy's lawyer we were going to be filing something that day, that once I filed it, I was worried that we would no longer be able to try to calm things down and maybe resolve the case short of going to a formal hearing. And so, yeah, that was that I never, when the police called, that's what I thought it was about. It's an officer that I knew, that I had stored in my phone. I had worked with her in the past on some stuff. And when she called, I said, "Hey, Annie, how you doing?" And she said, how do you know Dan Markel? And I said, "What? How do you know Dan Markel?" And she barked it. And I was like, she's in cop mode right now. This isn't Annie calling me, on a side issue. And so I immediately went into lawyer mode. And I thought, and I knew Annie at the time worked in violent crimes. And so I thought, oh my gosh, she did it. She made up some bogus allegation against Dan. And I said, well, he's my client. I want to speak to him. And she said, you can't. I said, no, I can. I represent him right now in an active proceeding. I want to talk to him. And I could tell at that point, Annie, you could just sense it over the phone. I can't describe it, but she said, you can't, because something really bad has happened. And then at that moment, I knew they killed him, or somebody had killed him. I don't know why my mind went there the way it did. Part of it was Annie's tone. At that point, it all made a lot more sense, because Annie was a pretty high-ranking officer in the Tallahassee Police Department. Even if Wendy had made a bogus allegation of battery, Annie wouldn't have been calling me. Yeah. It would have been some, if anybody called me, it would have been a patrol type officer. But then I realized, oh my gosh, I'm on his phone calling him, and something's happened to him, and I just knew they'd killed him. And that's why she's calling me, to probably make sure I wasn't a suspect at that point.
Okay. Sure, we'll get to that soon, because there are other questions about that. But I know it's kind of hard to do it chronologically, because there's so many details and so many questions. But Mealy wants to know, did Dan and Wendy really go to marriage counseling? Do you know anything about that?
I don't recall if I spoke to Dan about that, but I got the distinct impression after being involved in the case that Wendy was never going back to Dan. When she left that house, sometime before she left, she had checked out, and she was not checking back in.
They were divorced already, but by the time you represented him, right?
Yes.
2014. Okay. I think you touched on this, but what action was Dan going to take for Wendy's alleged thievery?
Well, he wanted to hold her in contempt of court. And the problem there is, there were so many the fallout from that for a lawyer could be devastating. And that was the reason why I met with Wendy's attorney at at the end of June was to try. I told Dan, I said, look, I owe it to your children, to you, to everybody, to at least try to talk to her lawyer to see if we can turn the temperature down, maybe figure out some way we can work together to resolve the issues we have, you know, because I was like, look, if we start bringing this stuff up in court and prove it, Dan had the receipts. So as my kids would say, we were going to prove that Wendy had filed, you know, her affidavits were false, and she had not disclosed all the money and assets and property that she had, and he could demonstrate it. And I was worried that once we did that, that the court may feel like the court had an obligation to notify the bar, or I may have an obligation to notify the bar as an attorney. And that, you know, and if it came to that, for whatever her reasoning was at the time that she did it, it could have, you know, inexorably affect her ability to practice law and the children. And, you know, and I just, if we had to go there, we had to go there. But I legitimately was going to try to short circuit the fight if I could by meeting with her lawyer. And so I met with him in the end of June, but that's kind of the direction we were going. Dan didn't care about the money. It was never about the money. So he didn't care. He cared about the diamond ring, the diamond. But as far as property goes, he was not motivated at all by the property. So he wasn't going to do anything further, you know, than that, but he was going to go into court and prove it. And, you know, in the dissolution paperwork, there was a clause that basically said if it's discovered that one of the parties has not basically disclosed all of their assets or things like that, that it shall act as a breach of the contract, and all bets are off essentially at that point. So that was the way the litigation was going.
Yeah. Do you have any idea what happened to the ring?
I don't. I mean, she kept it. And, you know, and Dan wasn't really mad about that. He was hurt. You know, that hurt him, I think probably for his family as much as anything. You know, but it was pretty remarkable to me when he was telling me that. You know, I was thinking to myself, wow, like who could do that?
Yeah.
I know divorce work can be pretty nasty. I know, you know, I've lived with it, dealt with it, watched it, observed it. But even that, especially for a law professor, and I don't know, I was naive enough to think at the time that when it was all said and done, I would be able to convince Jimmy Judkins, her lawyer, or her to, you know, prevail upon them to do the right thing in that regard. Little did I know.
Yeah. So how much interaction did you have with Dan before he was shot?
We would talk at least every other day. I mean, you know, when he was killed, you know, we spoke the day before, spoke that morning. I was calling him back that afternoon. We talked quite a bit. Like I said, it was strange. I liked him a lot, and we would make kind of just small talk when we would talk. So we talked quite a bit. I mean, it was like almost a daily basis. We would talk at some point. And he, you know, he was just, he wasn't at all what you would expect for a law professor. And I think kind of my passion for the law, you know, like I realized that going to law school at 32 years old was a conscious choice. Obviously it wasn't, well, what do I do now? I mean, I knew it was what I wanted to do. That's why I said I enjoyed law school, because I did. I'm like crazy like that. It was academic boot camp. I understand that, you know, the toughest academic setting I've been in, but I really enjoyed learning and learning about the law and studying the law and talking about the law. And obviously Dan did as well. And so I think that was a big part of it. You know, we would talk about the law and his theories and his research and things of that nature. So we spoke a lot.
This is another comment from TCAT. Sorry, technical issues here. Your testimony was very compelling, told us exactly who Dan was versus what Wendy is. Did Dan really owe her money? Like she kept telling anyone.
Oh,
I
did
think
I
she
freeze?
was, yeah, I think she was talking about money for her share of the house. Do you
And
remember that?
yeah, and I know the attorney's fees was a sticking point as well.
Yes.
There's no doubt that Dan had not fulfilled all of his financial obligations under the marital settlement agreement, and but she had not fulfilled her obligations as well, and so that's what the litigation was about. And really and truthfully, I mean, the money that she hid from Dan um, pretty much made it a wash in that regard. But what it really was about was the alienation. Like Dan, like this was his hammer that he had, that he knew he had to use against Wendy, um, was to reveal the fact that she had not been honest and forthright in all of her filings. But he didn't want to use it for money. That wasn't, once again, that's not why he was using it. He was using it because he was going to ensure that Donna Adelson did not talk about him that way in front of his children. And there were other things, he felt like that they weren't respecting his time. So in essence, that was what he was going to use this leverage to try to force upon them and bring in front of the court the fact that that he felt like that Donna was consciously trying to alienate him from his children. And I do absolutely believe she was. We know that now. And I also want to say I appreciate what you do, Judy. All of the podcasters that cover this. It's important. I was listening to a podcast when I was driving yesterday about a murder in North Carolina 20 something years ago. And Denise Johnson. And, there's so many cases like that just kind of sit out there and don't get any attention. And podcasts like yours and the podcast I was listening to, it brings the case, it keeps the case alive. And I think it keeps the pursuit of justice alive. So thank you for everything that you do.
Sure. Yeah, it's a privilege to be able to just try to do what we can to help. And that's why I'm still doing it, even though my voice is totally deteriorating, as you can see. So thank you for talking most of the time. So I think you covered this, but did you think Wendy's license would have been at risk?
I did. And I genuinely believe that. And I honestly, it probably still should be. She's never been held accountable for that, and she should have been. But I really was kind of the mindset that if I went into court and we proved it in court, that I was going to have a duty myself to go to the bar. As a lawyer, if you know another lawyer has done something that egregious, you can't just ignore it. And I felt like once I went to court and it was in a court record, that it was going to be a point where I couldn't ignore it. It's one thing on paper when I talked to Dan at a coffee shop, but if we go into court, and especially if she doubled down on my request for admissions and lied again and denied that she had hidden and concealed the assets the first time, I mean, that was essentially the trap. You're either going to admit you did it once, in which case there probably may not be a need for a lot of evidence to be put in the record at the hearing. I'm just going to introduce your answers to my request for admissions. But if she did it twice, then there was no doubt that I was not going to just sit idly by while she committed a second act of fraud on the court. So,
yeah. And didn't she also lie in her deposition, saying that she would give that ring back if Dan's great uncle asked her for it?
It was my understanding that she had said that, yes, and I think she had said it again at another point to Dan, and he had asked for it, but she never did return it. So, as you know, um, whether or not that's material to the deposition and for purposes of perjury or whatever, it certainly is an indictment of her character, if nothing else. Just the fact that she would keep it to begin with is just remarkable.
Yes. Dee Meitner, does he think Dan had any clue at all just how evil Wendy really was?
I don't think so. No. I think Dan knew that Donna was evil. I think Dan knew that. He conveyed that to me, that she was dangerous, and it's not physically dangerous. Like once again, we weren't thinking they were going to do this, but he definitely believed that Donna was evil enough to hurt the children's psyche, poison their relationship with their father, to fit her ends. But I don't think he understood what Wendy was capable of.
Did he ever tell you he thought she had mental health issues? Because supposedly he had said that to people at the law school.
He did not say things like that to me. He really didn't disparage Wendy. When we talked about it more in a business type relationship, I honestly tried to stay away from a lot of kind of the more emotional aspects of it, the nature of the prior relationship, because all that stuff to me was a distraction for where we were, and our litigation was focused in my mind solely on proving who was rightfully in contempt of court. And the emotions were still somewhat raw for Dan. Dan still cared for Wendy. It was clear to me. He still cared for her. Now, he had an amazing girlfriend that he was happy with and everything else, but it's not like, in spite of kind of everything she had done, he didn't see her as an evil monster, even though her actions would probably have supported him reaching that conclusion. But he did not necessarily with her. But like I said, with Donna, he absolutely made it clear to me that Donna was not a trustworthy person and was capable of, we know now, anything. But he absolutely believed she was going to hurt those children if it would help her get what she wanted.
Yeah. So sad that Donna has pretty much raised the kids for the last 10 years.
Yeah. It burns, it hurts to think about that.
Yeah. So you've talked about this earlier, but what else did you think about when you first heard the news?
I absolutely believe that they were involved. The family was involved. I didn't know exactly who, but I didn't believe it was. I just knew it wasn't random. I don't know why. Before she even told me he was dead, she just said something really bad has happened, and I just knew. And my first thing was, oh my gosh, they killed him. I can still feel it, remember it, and it was crazy. It's still crazy. If I woke up this morning and Dan Markel was still alive and it was all a dream, it would make more sense to me. The past 10 years, and we were at a baseball tournament for my son, and I was just like in a daze. It stayed that way. I stayed that way for weeks. I remember I was sitting, and we'd come back. It was well over a week, and we'd come back, and I was in my office, and I was back in the conference room, and I was supposed to be working on something, and I was literally just sitting there staring at the papers, thinking about it, and unaware that I was doing that. And the receptionist buzzed me on the conference phone and kind of snapped me out of it. And she said, there's a doctor's office in Miami that wants to talk to you about Dan Markel. And I said, okay. So I grabbed the phone, and at that point, I didn't know Wendy had already moved, right? Like, and they said, hey, it's our understanding that you represent the father. I was like, well, I did. And the mother's here, and she wants to get treatment with the boys, but we need the consent. And I said, well, I mean, I don't know what authority I have. I mean, I'm pretty sure I have zero authority. But by the same token, I said, look, but if these kids need treatment, then treat them. I'll take whatever the fallout is, that comes from that. I'll accept it, the consequences. You have my consent. You have my permission. Like, whatever authority I have, you have it. And the woman, she was like, no, it's not like that. It's not urgent. The mother just wants to change their primary care physician from the doctor in Tallahassee to the doctor down here in Miami. And you could have literally knocked me over with a feather. I could not believe it. I was sitting in my conference room, still in a daze, unable to focus on my practice and my work that I needed to do because I couldn't stop thinking about how he was murdered. I just couldn't get over it. And meanwhile, Wendy is out just going through mundane tasks, changing primary care physicians as if nothing really had happened to upset.
How soon was that?
I've tried to go back. I called Craig Isom, the detective, and told him. I feel like I think we were at that tournament for at least a week because actually my son's team won. So we ended up staying all the way to the very end of it. But I feel like it was a Tuesday after I'd come back to work. I could probably go back and figure it out, but
it was pretty soon.
Oh yeah. I mean, it was within 2 weeks. It was within 2 weeks, and I don't know. It was way too soon. Whatever it was. Like I said, I was still, I can't describe it, but I don't know, man. It did something to me. Dan's murder just still can't shake it, like still 10 years later. It's just palpable because of who they killed. They literally murdered the greatest father I've ever had an opportunity to meet. And in a world where there aren't enough great fathers, there aren't enough good fathers, to take away one of the best fathers that those two boys could have ever been birthed into and with, it's just it's an injustice to those boys that it haunts me. And so yeah, there I was at the table, like I said, just thinking about the loss. And meanwhile, Wendy was just out checking off the to-do list, in her new town.
Yeah, signing up the kids for school, changing their names.
No big deal,
informally.
Yeah.
Yeah,
to protect them. So yeah, no, Dan didn't know how evil she was, but at that moment, I did.
Wendy wasn't actually named as a conspirator by the state until maybe early 2022. But so were you shocked at all when she was named as a co-conspirator?
Not when she was named, but I am shocked, still. Like I said, if I woke up this morning and this had all been a dream, it would make more sense to me than sitting here talking to you about it in real life. So it is shocking. It's insane. I mean, it's insane that this happened. It's hard to fathom that people can be that evil and can appear that normal, I guess. The hugely successful medical practices they had and all their credentials, and then this is the reality of it. they're plotting cold-blooded murderers, and not only just murderers, but like to murder the most important, one of the two most important people in those boys' lives. Um, a true gift from God is what Dan was to those boys. He was a true gift from God, and they took that from them. It's just unbelievable.
Thank you for sharing. Did you ever meet Wendy yourself?
No. But she called my office. I forgot about this. She called my office after the murders, and I honestly can't even remember if I talked to her. When I tell you, like, I was in a daze after that, I mean, I was. It's just hard to explain, like, how, you know what I mean? Like, you just can't believe it. And so, my receptionist reminded me, and she called, and it was some stupid question that she called and asked, and I can't recall now what it was, but to me, it immediately felt like she was trying to take my temperature. You know, she was trying to see, like, is he on a warpath up there? She probably knew I had friends in the state attorney's office. I had friends in the police department. I'd represented some police officers. By that time, I'd represented several police officers in different matters. If they were involved in shootings and had to go to grand juries, and police officers that were involved in some administrative things if they got in trouble at work, you know. So I don't know. I felt like she was hoping to talk to me just to kind of see, like, you know, what's this guy doing? You know, if I would tip my hand, you know, would I get on the phone and just excoriate her or whatever? But I never met her in person.
That's weird because she had an attorney. So why would she be calling you?
Mm-hmm.
Seems kind of
Yeah,
bizarre.
it didn't make sense. So
Yeah.
like I said, I can't even remember if I spoke to her, but my receptionist reminded me of it. And because I think that's what it was. I didn't speak to her, but I wasn't in. And so my assistant actually said, well, you know, what is it about? And so then she said she would call back. But she never called back. So.
Yeah, very strange. So you mentioned you did talk to some of the police.
Yes. I talked to Craig Eisen, the detective, the lead detective. I knew Craig. I'd worked with him when I was at the state attorney's office. I'd worked with him on cases and in other kind of things. So I knew him. You know, he was one of the guys at the police department I felt like I knew pretty well. And I talked to him. I talked to him originally, you know, and then when she called, when the pediatrician's office called, I called. And actually, her attorney called me because apparently, like, there had been a confusion on their end in their office. I think the pediatrician was supposed to call her lawyer, not me. Anyway.
Yes.
But
So I forgot to ask you, because Dan was killed, were all those motions then moot?
yeah,
They couldn't be heard.
Everything was moot. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
that was it. The end of the case.
Yeah, but what happened to that house then? Because Wendy was saying that she was owed money for the house. So did she just get the house?
No, I mean, basically she walked away with what she had. You know, at that point, it was all mooted. Those issues were never resolved. Dan's estate was set up, and what belonged in his estate belonged in his estate. Obviously, it was all dedicated to his children. But no, that ended that.
Yeah. So nothing could be done, for example, about that ring.
Yeah. The estate could have probably sued, you know, or something for it. But nothing ever did else. Nothing else came of it.
Okay.
To my knowledge, she never.
I'm sorry.
And to my knowledge, she never returned it. So.
Yes, that's what I've heard. Yeah. Do you feel like answering this question? what are your opinions about how the Adelsons avoided prosecution for so long?
Well, I don't. Here's what I'll say. The former state attorney Willie Meggs, he he didn't get along with TPD all that well, the Tallahassee Police Department, and there was some real acrimony there towards the end of his tenure between himself and the Tallahassee Police Department. And I genuinely don't believe he gave the Tallahassee Police Department a fair shake on the case. I think he should have filed charges long before. I appreciate the fact that Mr. Campbell, Jack Campbell, has come in. But with that being said, there's a flip side to that. And thankfully, a lot of the investigators remain dedicated and continue to work and still are working. State Attorney's Office investigator, I mean, Lord have mercy. I mean, the work that the State Attorney's Office has done on this case is unprecedented. They're investigators. The FBI, they were still doing wiretaps, and wiretaps they're daunting. I mean, it's a lot of work to sit around and listen to those calls. And so the flip side to that is the good news is, as a result, I think the cases are stronger. We have more evidence, a better picture of what had happened. And so I don't believe that it was a situation where there was privilege. I don't believe it's that. I think you can see, I mean, certainly the prosecutors, the officers, the police, law enforcement officers involved, they certainly wanted this day to come sooner rather than later themselves. So.
Did you know Willie Meggs?
I did. I worked for him.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
You mean back when you were a law student?
Back when I went to work for the state attorney's office, he was the state attorney when I was an assistant state attorney. And so, I had a chance to be around him, and he made it known, like he didn't have a lot of use for the folks at the Tallahassee Police Department. He had a personal kind of vendetta against them. And I felt like it impacted justice here and served basically as an injustice here. Thankfully, Jack Campbell, we have a new state attorney, and he, I think, has really made sure that the pursuit of justice has continued. And obviously Georgia and Sarah Catherine, their dedication to the case is unparalleled. But I know there are other prosecutors in that office that have helped. I know Rachel Jankowski. I mean, I've heard, that they've dedicated a lot of resources to it. And I don't think people understand kind of how that works unless you work in an office like that. At the end of the day, the state attorney's office is a law firm, but they've only got so many lawyers, so many paralegals, so many investigators, and they've got all these cases, and so somehow Mr. Jack Campbell, our state attorney now, he's got to figure out a way to make that funnel work so that the resources that he has can catch the cases that need to be captured and prosecuted. And so it takes a conscious decision to dedicate resources to it. You have to, you can't fight every fight, unfortunately. And so, obviously I'm grateful that they've done it. And here we are 10 years later, they're still working. I know they're still working hard to achieve justice.
About rumors that Meggs was friends with Adelson friends.
I don't believe that at all. That's
okay.
Frankly, I think, I don't believe that's the problem.
Thank you. Okay, these are just some comments. People appreciated you testifying.
Thank you.
Okay. Ellen Stewart, she's very thankful to you.
And thank you, Helen.
We portrayed the boss. Dan was. Okay. Let's see here. Oh, how has this experience changed your outlook? I guess that's kind of a general question, but how has it changed your outlook on cases or clients?
Yeah, I mean, never say never, huh? Yeah, life doesn't make as much sense as it did 10 years ago. You know, um, you I know bad things happen to good people, but I don't know when something this raw, this this level of injustice comes into your life, even though it wasn't my brother or anything like that, but just to see it, to experience it, it it just like life just doesn't always make sense, and you know that th- that's what I that's all I can say. It just, like I said, I can't still to this day wrap my brain around it. It's just inconceivable, um, as that word could be used. I guess maybe it doesn't mean what I think it means, but you just can't imagine how those people who allegedly love those boys, and I think they do love those boys. I'm sure they do. I'm sure they love, in their weird, twisted way, they love their grandchildren, and their nephew sons. But um, if it's there's no world where they can love those children, can exist, and then they did this to Dan Markel can also exist. And that's what I just, every time I kind of get on the hamster wheel thinking about it, like once I get to the point where I think about those two concepts at the same time, my whole world gets turned back upside down again, and I start back on the hamster wheel. I guess that's what it is. For 10 years, I've been trying to make sense of that part of this puzzle, and I can't, and I never will. It will never make sense. So I'm just one guy out here. You know what I mean? Like, to think about what Dan's, best friends and his sister and parents, how they can find a way to deal with it. I can't imagine. I just can't imagine how they function. But I will say they are some of the most graceful, amazing, beautiful people. So I guess maybe that's why they can deal with it.
So you've gotten to talk to his parents?
Yes, and I've had a chance to get to know both of them, unfortunately, as a result of this. And they're just really, really, truly remarkable people. And you can see how Dan, where he came from. Phil's he's just got a heart of gold. And Ruth, is her determination, but her grace and strength is it's unlike anything I've seen. And Shelley, I really feel for her, because she's missed out on opportunities to be an aunt, and to have her brother and her children's lives, and so but they're incredible people.
Definitely. I guess this, of course, would be your opinion, but do you have any response to this question?
I believe that Wendy will be arrested. I've said it before, and I still believe it. I believe she will be arrested. And her driving by the house, her talking about hitmen to TV repairmen and to Jeff Lacasse and to others, I just believe her driving by, that will ultimately be her undoing, and hopefully soon.
Okay. This question, do you feel like those co-conspirators are capable of committing more murders, if not stopped?
Yeah, everything I've heard about Sigfredo Garcia is like he is a legit gangster. Like he is straight up, no empathy, no kind of conscience, and I think that I think he's probably certainly could have been capable of doing it again in the future. As far as the Adelsons, I know that there are people that were legitimately scared after Dan's murder, that some people that even kind of relocated. So I know there were other people out there that still felt like they were capable of additional acts of retribution. In order, like, I mean, look, if Dan's life they didn't place any value on the father of their, of Ben and Lincoln's father, they didn't place any value on his life, then they certainly wouldn't place any value on anybody else's life.
Yeah. No, same thing with Charlie. Just from what we've heard, people have said that Charlie was the type of person who could plot to try to get things done against people without it being traced to himself.
Yeah, it almost seems to me like this is a guy who, you listen to his jail phone calls and stuff. He like tries to play like the role, of like he's got street cred and he's gangsta.
He's gangster, dentist gangster.
Yeah, he's the periodontist gangster, and he really did, though. You know what I mean? Like, so I think he fancied himself that way. Like, he thought he was cool like that he could, he was hip and slick, and so, I think he probably did boast that he had that, friends and stuff like that, and so bizarre.
And this is just a rumor, but rumor is that Wendy is planning to move to Austin. So, what's your response to this question?
I don't know anything about that. I've heard that, and I've heard it from people that I think know what they're talking about. So, I can't help but wonder. Like, look, let's be honest. She was never the full-time mom to those boys. I mean,
Yeah.
Even up here, Donna would come up here and spend a lot of time. Wendy couldn't drive herself from Tallahassee to Miami. Mommy and Daddy had to come drive her. And now that, mom's in prison or jail, hopefully heading to prison. And my understanding is that Harvey's not doing well. He certainly probably can't offer a lot of help and assistance with the children. That's what I think it is. She just basically is either disinterested or incapable of filling the role.
Yeah. Okay. And this is from someone that I believe is actually friends with the Markels. You mentioned, yes, you do think she's going to be arrested.
I do.
Right? Yeah.
I do.
Yeah.
I mean, nobody at the state attorney's office has told me that, but they've been moving along methodically, and I just feel like they've got enough, and the jury will say guilty.
Yes, that there could be plenty of evidence that wasn't brought out at previous trials.
I'd bet on it, I mean, the focus has never really been about Wendy. So I would bet on that they have evidence we don't know about.
Okay. Do you believe the boys were completely unaware of the effect the murder had? Surely they figured it out by now. I guess it's just a guess, right?
Yeah.
What do you think?
I know that denial, it can be a very powerful tool, especially when you're talking about, a self-preservation coping mechanism. Denial can actually help protect somebody's brain. So I imagine it would be very difficult for either one of those boys to really kind of accept that, given the fact that they've been isolated, especially they've been isolated from the Markels. And I feel like the Markels have been vilified over the years. So but I have to believe those boys are brilliant, because Dan was absolutely brilliant. So I feel like there will come a day where they will ultimately reunite with the Markels and hopefully move past a lot of that.
And unfortunately, I do have to get going soon, and I'm sure you have plenty of things to do there. So this is also from another friend of Dan's parents, talking about his boys what would you like to say to his boys if they are listening?
I would just like to say I'm sorry that I have gone on podcasts and said things that probably caused you pain when I talked about Wendy, Charlie, Donna, Harvey, people I know that you love. And I'm sorry for that. Sorry I caused you any pain. But by the same token, I was your father's advocate when he was alive and when he was murdered. And I'm going to be your father's advocate until I am no longer alive. And the main thrust of my advocacy for your father now is trying to make sure that you know, contrary to whatever you may have heard, he was an amazing father. He loved you more than anything. And no father has ever loved children more than your dad loved you. And that's really why I feel like it's important for me to go out and try to speak, because I hope and pray that you will know that. You know, your mother has gone on the record saying that, you know, she tried to continue to foster a love between you and for your father. And I hope that's true. But no matter what, it's the only thing I can do. The only value I think I can really add is to try to make sure that the world knows. And hopefully one day you boys will hear this from me. And if you didn't know it, you'll open your minds and your hearts to it, because man, he loved you. He loved you.
Okay. Thank you so much for sharing all these great thoughts and memories of Dan. So I'm so sorry I have to leave and don't have time to get to every single question, but I hope you enjoyed the rest of your trip.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay.
Thank
It's
you.
nice. Great to talk to you. Hope I'll see you in Tallahassee.
I hope so.
Okay. Thank you. Take care,
everybody.
and we'll be in touch.